just delighted to present Dr. Valerie Johnson as our guest speaker for the Spring Faculty Forum. Dr. Johnson received her PhD from the University of Maryland, College Park. She is the chair of the Political Science Department and associate professor at DePaul. She's the author of Black Power in the Suburbs, The Myth or Reality of African American Suburban Political Incorporation, and she's the co-editor of Power in the City. Currently, she is writing a book entitled At the Water's Edge, The Unfinished Business of Black Equality. Her research interests include African American politics, urban politics, and education policy with a particular focus on the politics of urban education. Consistent with her research focus, Dr. Johnson is the former national education spokesperson for the Reverend Jesse L. Jackson and the Rainbow Push Coalition, and has served as a consultant for elected officials and community organizations nationwide. Dr. Johnson is also chair of the Chicago Black Congress, the SBCC, which seeks to mobilize all segments of the community of African descent in Chicago to tackle problems in a myriad of areas, including education, joblessness, crime, and violence. We're very grateful you're here today to speak on what is probably the most important subject of the day. Thank you very much.
I always look forward to an opportunity to talk to a multicultural, multiracial group of people about race, because I do think that if we talk more about race, candidly and openly, without hostility, that we could begin to resolve some of the problems that we have, problems that are entrenched in the past and that are entrenched in continuing racism. I think at first glance, it might be difficult to understand why the DePaul Women's Network would choose a topic like Black Lives Matter. But it is really appropriate given the founders of Black Lives Matter. When you look at Black Lives Matter, it was founded in 2013 after the acquittal of George Zimmerman for murdering Trayvon Martin, and I purposefully say murder because I think it was clear to everyone except the jury that it was murder. The founders are Alicia Garza, Opal Tamati, and Patrice Cullors, 3 African American women and young women, okay? And so hence the appropriateness of to talk about an organization that is led by Black women for an organization, and I forgot, you know what? Not only is this sponsored by Down, but also DePublic as well, right? Okay, I'm sorry. Okay, so 3 Black women, 2 of whom are queer. And the last time I gave this talk, I gave this same talk actually, I think it was January or February, but then I was asked to just kind of do it again. So some of you might be hearing this for the second time. If so, act like it's all new. But the last time I gave this talk, when I say queer, people were like, wow, isn't that a pejorative term? But of course, queer has been reappropriated. Initially, it was of course a pejorative term, but queer has been reappropriated by the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender community. And so it's not a pejorative term. The 3 the founders are professional organizers, and they work with domestic workers, immigrants, and they have for some time worked for criminal justice reform. There are a number of associated organizations. The times that I have been a participant of some of the protests, particularly in Chicago, surrounding the shooting death of Laquan McDonald. What has been so enriching is the fact that not only do you have like Black Lives Matter out there, but you have a number of associated organizations that are chiefly, like for instance, Assata's Daughter. I mean, these are Black women-led organizations. It is just absolutely inspiring to see. And as an older person, having been born in the 60s, you know, it's just so inspiring to see young people and young women in particular really take up the charge, right? Because I think it is time for another civil rights movement, and that's why I love Bernie so. Shameless plug, right? You know, I think that we get so accustomed to politics as usual. When you look at the election cycle, it's like we do the same thing every 4 years. Hey, vote for me and I'll set you free. And then the conditions never change, right? Because most of the problems related to not only race, but just socioeconomic conditions in general they're structural, right? And so in order to resolve a structural problem, you have to change the structure. But what we're trying to do is to change, you know, just sort of enduring problems with the same structure. And that's probably not going to work. Black Lives Matter is a chapter-based national organization, so it has chapters all over the United States. And it is working for the validity of Black life and to rebuild the Black liberation movement. I am so happy that Black Lives Matter is not a hierarchical organization. It is truly built in the equality of its members. Now, some people might argue, well, and I'll just kind of deal with this up front, because I think one of the chief criticisms of the Black Lives Matter movement is, and even my brother, I got in an argument with him recently about this. He's been a cop going on 30 years, and so he's looking at the problem of inner city violence from a totally different perspective. You know, he says I'm the highbrow intellectual who, you know, I'm in the ivory tower pontificating about things, and he's on the front line, right? And so he, like other people, arguing, well, if Black Lives Matter, why don't the organization protest the tremendous violence that is occurring within the Black community? If Black Lives Matter, shouldn't it matter equally to everyone, right? And also, shouldn't it matter to the very people who extol this virtue of Black lives? And I just want to say, and we'll talk about it a little bit more, we'll unpackage it, but there is a big difference between Black on Black violence and police on Black violence. And it is because Black on Black violence is really a manifestation of a larger issue. When you place people in marginalized and oppressed circumstances, guess what? They're going to act different. They develop adaptive strategies for living in sort of marginalized, settings. And so when you look at the tremendous joblessness, when you look at underfunded education, a number of structural conditions, it is no wonder that you find people in inner city or poor communities more involved in crime. And then never mind the fact that when you look at the war on drugs or any sort of law enforcement measure, it is typically those that war on drugs is fought in inner city communities, right? And so it creates a different type of setting. So sure, we should really eschew, try to eradicate Black on Black violence, but we cannot do that until we have resolved some of the problems related to poverty, unequal education, joblessness. Joblessness is certainly a tremendous problem within Black communities and Latino, other core communities. And so, to suggest that Black Lives Matter should protest a structural condition, I mean, there's not much you can do about a structural condition through a protest, right? But when you have violence perpetrated by the state on Black communities, then that's something that you can push for reforms for. But the bottom line is Black Lives Matter notes, it's more than about police violence, police on Black violence. It's about resolving some of the tensions. So Black Lives Matter is and has been a present and engaged fixture at over 1,000 protests. You have seen, we have witnessed the cropping up of just thousands of protests across the country, all around something that literally has been occurring since time immemorial. I think the tendency is to think, oh wow, we've got this rash of police on black violence. No, this has been, I mean, if you Google police on black violence, you might get some articles from the slavery period. I mean, I'm being facetious, but this has gone unabated. I mean, literally after slavery, when you look at vagrancy laws and all of that, that was police on black violence, you know, and so there has always been that condition. I think what has made it so called attention to it is the use of the camera phone, right? I mean, just for people to be able to videotape it and, you know, cast it on TV. And so it is not a new condition, but Black Lives Matter has certainly addressed it. You look at the murder of, and I unapologetically say murder, because Tamir Rice was murdered. I mean, that 12-year-old boy, how do you know, sort of drive up on a 12-year-old kid and within seconds shoot him dead, right? And we know that that would not have been tolerated if Tamir Rice were white. You know, we would have lost our collective minds, okay? Eric Harris, Walter Scott in North Charleston, do you all remember that one? That was where the guy's running away and gets shot 6 times in the back. And then there was, as has been the case for all of these, there's always this attempt at cover-up. Corey Jones, Jonathan Farrell, Sandra Bland, Samuel Du Bois, Freddie Gray, of course, was it Monday or Tuesday was the 1-year anniversary of the murder of Freddie Gray in Baltimore. Remember, it was this time last year that we saw the uprising, the Baltimore riots, and that was like, you know, people were really shocked by that. And I think to the extent that this has become a salient issue, it is because of media projections of riots and demonstrations. But again, for the vast majority of people, it's like, why are they protesting? You know, because we are largely divorced of the conditions, many of the conditions in which a large segment of our U.S. population live. We don't understand that the civil rights movement didn't resolve, again, some of these seemingly intractable problems. The tactics of Black Lives Matter: direct action, disrupting traffic on highways, bridges, tunnels, disrupting the profit motive. Trust and believe that the protests and demonstrations surrounding Laquan McDonald on Black Friday were not looked upon positively by the merchants on Michigan Avenue, right? I mean, people were losing their mind, because anytime you interfere with the profit motive, you get people's attention. And so on Michigan Avenue, the Black Friday protest cost stores 25 to 50% of their sales. And so that certainly gained people's attention. Another tactic, grassroots organizing via social media, community education through town hall meetings and panels. And again, that's why I started out by saying, I really like to engage people about issues of race, because it is only through community education and open and candid discussions that we can advance, right? And so they do a lot of that. Presidential politics, you saw the interruption. I think Bernie Sanders was interrupted at one point. People were like, why did they do that to Bernie? Why did they do that to Trump or whatever? I think they felt that, wow, we should interrupt Bernie because of, if we can't get progressive candidates or progressive people to understand that this is an issue, you can forget, you know, getting people who are staunch conservatives like Donald Trump who I'm convinced is not really a conservative. He's just an agitator, right? He's just trying to get elected, and he'll use whatever methods needed. I mean, so he's playing to, to people, whatever people are feeling their tremendous anger and angst at the system. Some of the guiding principles of Black Lives Matter: diversity, respecting and celebrating differences and commonalities; globalism, understanding that the fight, the quest for equal rights is not local, it is global, right? And so you have to connect with other struggles. It's Black women affirming, meaning it's anti-sexist, anti-male centered. When you look at, for example, other iterations of Black movements, they have always been very male dominated and male centered. And so this is a very Black women affirming. That is not to say that Black men are not a part of the struggle, of course. That is not to say that whites or Latinos or other groups are not a part of the struggle, but it does say that, we approach the enterprise of equality from a position of equality, not, the sort of male-centeredness. It's queer affirming, anti-heteronormative. It is transgender affirming, encouraging trans brothers and sisters to participate and lead. It is unapologetically Black. So many times, if someone says a Black this or a Black that, it's taken to mean that you're privileging one group over another. What it is recognizing that different groups have different needs. Just like the cartoon that I opened the presentation up with. You got these two people, they're talking. It's like, oh, I believe that all lives matter, which is true, right? And then you go to the next frame, and you've got a fireman hosing down a house saying, okay, all houses should matter. Yeah, but if that house is not on fire, do we give it the same attention that we give a house that is on fire? And so it is unapologetically Black, understanding that some of the conditions that we have seen in the past, they're still present within the African American community. A quote from Black Lives Matter: "To love and desire freedom and justice for ourselves is a necessary prerequisite for wanting the same for others." Another guiding principle is intergenerational. The older people affirming the younger people and vice versa. And this is what I like best, I've given it its own slide, it is unequivocally opposed to respectability politics, right? And, respectability politics is nothing more than sort of like politics as usual. It is a 20th century philosophy promulgated by the Black middle class, like, W.E.B. Du Bois. It's this notion that African Americans should, in some regards, participate in politics, mainstream politics, and value mainstream political strategies, rather than challenging society for its refusal, in some instance, to accept difference and to substantively address substantively address racial inequality. Because again, when you look at electoral politics, most elected officials give a lot of lip service to the need for, socioeconomic change and addressing inequality, but they're not substantive measures. It is also a political philosophy that centers on managing the behavior of Black people left behind in a society touted as being full of opportunity. Some people are left behind in our society, and we know who they are, right? And so I think that what we typically do to those people who are left behind is to focus our attention on their behavior. Again, not recognizing that their behavior is often an adaptive strategy for living in marginalized settings, okay? And I don't want you all to misunderstand me. I don't want you all to think that I'm like being an apologist for bad behavior, because of course, black on black violence is a problem. It is a real problem. I'm not by any means suggesting that it is a problem that should not be handled by the black community, but it is just a recognition that there are some limits to resolving it until we deal with some of the root causes. You know, you cannot have people who are in underfunded schools, jobless communities, poor health care, you know, mass incarceration, and expect them to act the same. I mean, it's similar, like when we bring in diverse populations here at DePaul, a predominantly white institution, and we see that they seek their own communities, and we say, why don't they just act like everyone else? And, you know, why do they have to have that black student union? Or, you know, why can't they just join the regular student union? Because in most instances, they have never interacted with white people before, right? And I think that most of us think that, oh, the problems of segregation have been resolved, right? But you have 75% of African American students go to majority minority schools, right? So when they come in a setting like this, do you think that they're going to be, you know, acclimated immediately? It doesn't work like that. And so many, do you think that they're going to have even a frame of reference for interacting with whites? I mean, what they have been taught implicitly as well as explicitly all their lives is that they don't matter and that they're inferior, that something is wrong with them. So naturally they come in a setting that is predominantly white and they feel inferior. And we know that white supremacy still prevails. Is that true? If I were to ask you, who is the dominant group in America? What would you say? Okay. I mean, so I think we would all be all in agreement with that, right? So how can we, I mean, I can't imagine there being anyone that you could ask that question to an American and they not admit that whites are the dominant group in America. So then, if we are very clear on that fact, how can we suggest that there is equality, right? That there are no sort of consequences associated with this white supremacy. And the consequences can be political, social, economic. You know, we can't act as if that's the case. Okay, so what does respectability politics look like? I thought I wanted to give you all a visual of respectability politics. I was just enraged. And again, this is not a partisan argument. I know there's some Hillary supporters in here, but I really feel kind of insulted by Hillary's relationship with the black community. Because, yeah, I've never known Hillary to necessarily do anything for the black community, but all of a sudden, election season, oh, yes, I'm a champion for the mothers whose kids have been murdered. You know, so this is Sandra Bland's mother, okay? And so, you know, have you all heard the commercial? It's like Morgan Freeman is narrating it, and it's sort of like, Hillary calls their names. And then in the background, you hear Hillary, Sandra Bland didn't do nothing wrong. You know, I'm like, that's all well and fine, but what about substantively dealing with the problems associated with police on black violence, right? You know, this is respectability. It's like politics as usual. Fighting for us? Okay, if these politicians are fighting for us, and I'm not just talking about white politicians, I mean, this is a picture of the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation. Of course, they endorsed Hillary, and John Lewis, he is a stalwart of the civil rights movement, but I was frankly embarrassed at his endorsement press conference because he was acting as if he's some sort of gatekeeper of the civil rights movement. I was like, what? He was like, I don't know about Bernie, but I know Hillary was in the movement. I'm like, the movement was so diffused. I mean, it's not like, you know, one person could possibly know everyone who marched or participated in the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement was a vast movement. It was multiracial, multicultural. So for him to suggest, oh, yeah, I don't know Bernie, I mean, why? To advance a particular politic, right? And so it's sort of like respectability politics. It doesn't get at the root causes of the problem. This is a picture of our president and first lady, Jimmy Carter and Bill Clinton at the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington. You know, again, it's always that presentation like we've arrived, post-racial, everything's great, everything's grand. But beneath the surface, we've got a sort of bubbling, a cauldron of sorts, you know? It's always that tension beneath the surface, and that is why a year ago, riots broke out in Baltimore, because we've never resolved the problem, and so there's always this tension at the surface. This is a quote from Sandra Bland's mother. When you're openly grieving and the Secretary of State steps to you, you better endorse her because she has already endorsed you. You know what it's kind of hard to, it's like, okay, she says something about Sandra Bland, so you endorse her without even fully understanding, because I believe me, I've gone online, I've looked at Hillary's page, and she says, oh, okay, we're going to end police violence in poor communities, but it's nothing substantive. And I've never seen her really, I've never seen where she was an activist for these causes in the past. But what this speaks to, often black politicians, black ministers, and people in general, they are so enamored with anybody who is going to even mention their cause. Because on a day-to-day basis, you know, issues like this are just not salient. Again, black and brown people get killed every single day, right? And so, I mean, it is like when a politician even mentions it, then that endears them to the community. And it's not based on any sort of, again, substantive change. It's just, my God, we have been in this situation and nobody's paying attention, so just the mere mention of it is something, okay? But Black Lives Matter, it's about more than police on black violence. And I got a couple of quotes here. Even if we were going to get an indictment or a guilty verdict, that actually would not provide us the larger vision of liberation that our communities actually deserve. Again, that speaks to it being more than just about the surface issue. For the first time in a long time, we are talking about alternatives to capitalism. State violence is bigger than police terrorism. Although police terrorism plays a specific role on behalf of the state, it is not the totality of what state violence looks like and feels like in our communities. What it looks like and feels like in minority inner city communities is it looks like poverty. Poverty is just as violent, right? When you think about, you know, a lack of nutrition, that's violence, and particularly in a wealthy society such as ours. It's also about building a better movement to tackle enduring issues. Black Lives Matter, in some respects it's new, but in some respects it's just a continuation of the struggle for black equality in this nation, okay? As I say here, I like that. The reality of the matter is we do not live in a post-racial society. After the election of Barack Obama, I think for most people it's like, we've arrived. But you know, that is mere symbolism. We do know that societal advantages and disadvantages are still parceled out by race. We have a sort of color-coded inequality, a color-coded equality. And the fact of the matter is, I want you to trust me when I tell you, because I study this, but in 1865, when African Americans, 4.5 million African Americans were freed from slavery, there was tremendous socioeconomic inequality between blacks and whites. And you could expect that. I mean, you know, you have a period of servitude where you're not making any money. Naturally, there was going to be some socioeconomic disparity. Guess what? That same socioeconomic disparity exists today. Why? Because it has not been resolved, okay? As I argue, it's like a monopoly game gone wrong, okay? And so let me solicit someone to assist me in this demonstration. Okay, what's your name? Mike. Mike and I are playing Monopoly. Halfway through the game, I realize Mike has been cheating. Okay? And so I call him out, and I'm like, Mike, you've been cheating, this is not fair. And so Mike is very contrite. I'm sorry. We're gonna adopt a new policy, okay? No more cheating, right? Everything's gonna be fair. And he says, let's resume the game. Now, what's wrong with that picture? He's got boardwalk, he's got a card place, he's got all those little greenhouses, the little red hotels. So every time I roll the dice, I'm landing on Mike's property. Okay, so let's fast forward a couple of 100 years, and people are looking at me like, lazy shiftless bum, why isn't she caught up? You know, I mean, it's like, disadvantage is cumulative. Unless you restart the game, and that is something, obviously, that we have not been willing to do. We have not restarted the game. Unless you restart the game, how can you really expect for people to be on an equal footing? Right? It is just not going to happen. So those same socioeconomic disparities, I mean, I'll give you a perfect example. The average household income for whites in Chicago, $94,000. Really? Average household, that's not even family, because you know a household could be one person, it could be multiple people, but a household is unrelated people, and there is not a family. The average household income for blacks in Chicago, $44,000. That's a $50,000 differential. Now you can only imagine that if you're living in the $94,000 a year household, you're having a totally different experience than someone living in the $44,000 a year household, right? And so again, that inequality has just gone forward because, I mean, you just look at something about like where you live. Where you live determines your access to grocery stores, health care, what schools you are going to go to. And so, again, it's cumulative. Advantages are cumulative and disadvantages are cumulative. And never mind, because, you know, some people will say, well, 1865 slavery has been over for a long time, but understand that there were policies that were, you know, racist. I mean, they continue too, right? Why would you need a civil rights movement, 1955? Most people put the start of the civil rights movement at 1955 to 1968. Why would you need a civil rights movement if the problems had been resolved 100 years before, right? Well, it was because African Americans, despite the fact that they had been freed from slavery, they still did not have civil rights, right? Another point, the presence of a few token blacks does not mean we have realized a democratic or equitable society, right? Sometimes I myself, as an African American woman, PhD, chair of a department at a large university, I feel, you know, people are looking at me like, what has she got to complain about? she's an angry black woman. What is she talking about? You know, it's easy. So if you're living in a white suburban community and you're working around people or your socioeconomic status, it's very easy to think that they're a microcosm of the entire population. But believe me, I'm not. Okay? I mean, it's the presence of Barack Obama and Michelle Obama. That does not mean we have realized a democratic and equitable society. Remember, in slavery, I mean, if any of you all have seen 12 Years a Slave, you know that even in slavery there were black people who were free, right? So that does not mean, I mean, just the fact that some black people have made it, it doesn't mean that opportunities are available for all. There's also a big difference between color blindness and equality. There is a term that Eduardo Bonilla Silva coined in his book, Racism Without Races, and the term is colorblind racism, right? And that sounds kind of, you know, it's like, how can color blindness be racism? Because most people think of color blindness as something good. You know, I wish I had a dime for every time I've heard someone say, well, Valerie, when I see you, I don't see race. It's like, that would be unusual. I mean, it's like, I walk in a room and you tell me you don't see race? Really? And then it also suggests that I don't want you to see my race. I want you to see me for who I am. I'm an African American woman. I have had perhaps unique experiences different than yours, but I'm fine with you seeing me as I am. So I don't really need you to be colorblind to that extent, but I mean, obviously they mean too that I'm not going to treat you differently because of your race, right? But to me, that is almost like saying, let's resume the game. Because we still have all these inequalities that we haven't dealt with. And so that's why Eduardo Bonilla Silva refers to it as colorblind racism. He says it's not like the racism of the past, you know, in your face, the N-word, sit on the back of the bus. It is, he calls it racism light, right? Because it is sort of like, okay, we're going to resume the game, we're going to treat everybody like they're equal, when in fact they're not, okay? There are some entrenched issues. Wealth by race and ethnicity, this is an example of some of the inequalities. Whites, their median net worth of households, $141,900. Blacks, and this is in 2013, 11,000, Latinos, 13,700. Vast difference in assets and net worth. Vastly different. And you know, of course, we take for granted the power of inheritance. In my family, this is the first generation that has had something to leave to the next generation. You know, that is a starting point. When you die and you have something to leave to your kids, again, it's cumulative advantages and cumulative disadvantages. Advantages and disadvantages accumulate, okay? And then, of course, you know, when you look at average income by race, gender, education, this chart basically says education pays, because at each interval of education, you see an increase in salary, okay? White males, no high school graduate diploma, high school graduate, and this is on average. Some of you white males some of you students don't get excited. You probably won't start out at 75. Hate to tell you. But obviously at every interval except doctorate, there is an increase in salary. But if you notice the difference, like white males without a high school graduation, without a high school diploma, on average make $25,386. Compare that to Latinas with some college. How do you account for that kind of difference? I mean, obviously, it's not all racism, because I think that some things are just about your network of opportunity. It may be that these white males, they know people who have businesses or jobs, connections, or whatever. And so even with more education, the Latina may not have those corresponding connections. If you look at the differential between a white male, on average, with a bachelor's degree and a black male, that's like a $24,000 a year differential. So education pays, but it does not pay equally for everyone. Now that could be explained by your choice of majors. If I go to an underfunded school in an inner city community that doesn't have any AP courses or doesn't have, you know, the sort of modern facilities and learning tools, I might not major in science and math, you know? And so, I mean, or it could be explained by racism, okay? Mean average household income in the United States, again, a differential. In Illinois, in Chicago, it's much wider than it is in the United States. Whites, 73,000, blacks, 44,000, Hispanics, 51,000, Asians, 84,000, and that doesn't suggest that all Asian groups are, you know, in the money. Obviously, there are, no group is a monolith, and so you have Southeast Asians, Japanese, Chinese who make more money than like Hmong's and Vietnamese. But big difference. Income, as I mentioned, 94,000 average household income for whites in Chicago compared to 44,000 for blacks in Chicago, Latinos 52,000. And typically Latino income is household income is a little higher than black because it is, Latinos have larger households. Poverty in Chicago, again, everyone's not having the same experience. And so you can imagine if you are living in a hyper poverty ridden area, guess what? There's some devastating correlations between poverty and violence. You know, I mean, anytime you have impoverished people living around one another, and it could be, whatever race or ethnicity, there are going to be different problems that you would have if you were living in a, you know, suburban middle-class community. Back to BLM. I know you all are probably like, is this talk about Black Lives Matter? But I'm trying to illustrate the fact that Black Lives Matter, they are justified in calling for a new way of, you know, doing things. They are justified in their call for black equality, you know, and so it's sort of like, it's very difficult to explain that to people if they do not understand the socioeconomic conditions, okay? As I mentioned, Black Lives Matter is just another iteration of previous black movements. You had the Black Abolitionist Movement, 1660s to 1865, Civil Rights Movement, 1955 to 1968. The Gary Convention was an attempt at a movement, and the Black Radical Congress was an attempt at a movement, right? With the Black Abolitionist Movement, unfortunately, after slavery was over, white supremacy prevailed. Civil Rights Movement, civil rights without substantive socioeconomic change. So again, it's sort of like, okay, we're going to have new policies, Civil Rights Act of 1964, Voting Rights Act of 1965, Fair Housing Act of 1968, new policies, but let's resume the game, right? That's a problem, you know, so you're still starting out and continuing on unequal footing. The Gary Convention, capitulation to mainstream electoral politics. The Gary Convention was in Gary, Indiana, and it was an attempt for black people of all socioeconomic statuses, et cetera, to come together to come up with a black agenda so that they could challenge politics as usual, right? Well, there was a lot of infighting, and the politics of respectability was alive and well. And so what happened after the Gary Convention, people kind of sided with the presidential candidates. You know, it's like, oh, okay, well, it's 1972, we need to, you know, people always kind of revert back to the lesser of two evils. You know, we are in the system, so we have to be of the system, but at the same time, as Black Lives Matter says, you have to make the system respond to your interests too, right? The Black Radical Congress, similar type of venture, but business as usual. And now we have the Black Lives Matter movement. And I think it's time. And you know, because of their efforts, some of the issues that had not been salient are. But just to give you an example of how Black Lives Matter philosophy is in line with other movements' philosophy, this is an excerpt from the Gary Declaration, which was a document that came out of the Gary Convention. The crisis we face as Black people are the crisis of the entire society. They go deep to the very bones and marrow, to the essential nature of America's economic, political, and cultural systems. They are the natural end product of a society built on the twin foundations of white racism and white capitalism. And when and if we form a third political movement, we shall take with us Chicanos, Puerto Ricans, Orientals, a wonderful kaleidoscope of colors. And that is not all. We shall also take with us the best of white America. We shall take with us many a white youth nauseated by the corrupt values rotting the innards of this society. Many a white intellectual, many of the white poor, and many of the white working class too. So even a movement that was organized around Black equality recognized the need for allies, right? Recognized the need to mobilize people who were interested in truly creating a more just and equitable society. Not just for minorities, but for poor whites as well, right? The Black Radical Congress, similar sort of agenda. This is in the late 90s. Black people face a deep crisis. Finding a way out of this mess requires new thinking, new vision, a deep spirit of resistance. We need a new movement of Black radicalism. We know that America's capitalist economy has completely failed us. Every day more of us are unemployed and in prison, homeless and hungry. Okay? And like Black Lives Matter, the Black Radical Congress called on diverse tendencies: socialism, revolutionary nationalism, feminism, opposition to all forms of oppression, class exploitation, racism, patriarchy, homophobia, anti-immigration prejudice, and imperialism, right? So some of the same sort of principles. Black Lives Matter, they say, when Black people get free, everybody gets free, right? Why? Because Blacks are typically, this is a quote, it is appropriate and necessary for us to acknowledge the critical roles that Black lives and struggles for Black liberation have played in inspiring and anchoring through practice and theory social movements for the liberation of all people. So again, similar to other movements, whether it's the Civil Rights Movement or other iterations, there's always this recognition that if we lift the bottom, that will positively impact everyone, okay? And so Black Lives Matter, like these other iterations, are revisiting the racism/capitalism nexus. We know that we live in a class-stratified society, and this is what Bernie is trying to tell you all. We live in a class-stratified society, and a class-stratified society confers advantages on people who have capital, right? If you do not have capital in a capitalist economy, you are probably going to suffer, right? Some of the hardest working people I know, right, are poor, right? There is unfortunately that. So capitalism is not really fair. You know, you could work hard. Just look at these people who are striking against Verizon. It's like, wow, you've got record profits. Why can't you share that with the workers, right? And so, but our laws, our policies, our elected officials, they allow that to happen. Why? Because they're like in bed together, right? And so we have to address that. But I think that our ability to address that for all is really kind of impeded by our incessant racial divide. You know, we always point to, it's always easy to point to those people. Oh, let's build a wall. Keep those Mexicans out because they are coming here and they're taking all of our jobs. I mean, it's insane, right? But it's always, you know, picking at, instead of turning to one another, turning against one another. And it's really holding us all down because we are actually all in the same boat. It's just a matter of degrees, right? So this nexus between racism and capitalism is like, okay, yeah, capitalism creates class stratification. Racism, past and continuing, ensures that minorities are the ones disproportionately on the bottom, right? So you've got to address that nexus. And that nexus has not been addressed by mainstream black politics, and it has not been addressed by the Democratic Party establishment. You know, I mean, it sounds good, but it's not. I mean, if it had addressed it, we would not have the tremendous socioeconomic disparities that I've mentioned. Differences between Black Lives Matter and black establishment politics, again, I'm telling you, just being around these young people at some of the protests and rallies, it's inspiring because they have a new vision. They have a new vision, and they're not sold out as many of the old timers are, you know, just trying to get our piece of the pie. They're trying to create a different pie altogether, and it is really, really inspiring, right? So they are anti-mainstream politics as usual, anti-heteronormative, and I say that because some of the problems that Black Lives Matter has faced in Chicago has been this sort of homophobic, tendency among the black political establishment. Here you have, you know, a rally. This was on Black Friday, surrounding the Laquan McDonald shooting. You got 2 congressmen, Reverend Jesse Jackson, then you got a lot of young people. This guy right here is actually a graduate of DePaul political science major. Anyway, so a little station break. And so you have all these people, and then you see these young women on the front. These are like Black Lives Matter protesters. Well, they got into a skirmish with some of the black establishment politicians because they were like, it's like, wow, this is not about homosexuality, and so because it was just unfortunate. And so they actually got into a skirmish with these young ladies, as I say, misogyny on the Magnificent Mile, because they wanted to silence them. And sometimes people will oppress you without really being conscious of it. I'll give you a perfect example. I was talking to a friend of mine about Black Lives Matter, and I was telling her, I said, it's really just inspiring that these women are, trying to eschew all forms of oppression, and, they are queer women, straight women, and so she was like, oh, I didn't realize that it was all about homosexuality. And I'm like, but it's not about homosexuality. They just happen to be homosexual, right? So, but this, I'm sorry.
Yeah, the way you're talking, is Black Lives Matter, because it was started by women, predominantly female?
It is
makeup?
And some, it is predominantly female in terms of the foundation, mm-hmm. And when you go to the rallies, there's a lot of women, mm-hmm. Yeah, but there are a lot of men as well.
Okay.
And like I said in the beginning, it really is an association of other organizations too. Just like out there for the Laquan McDonald protest, there were a lot of Occupy people from the Occupy movement. We haven't heard from them lately, but they're still out there and they're making connections. I really do think that we are moving toward a serious movement, a serious confrontation with politics and government as usual. I think some of the sort of manifestations of it is the popularity of Donald Trump on the right and Bernie Sanders on the left. There is trouble brewing. You know, people are dissatisfied. And so even people like the Occupy movement, people who have kind of, you don't hear anything about them, they're still out there building relationships with people. So Black Lives Matter in particular, founded by African American women, and a couple of the other groups have a heavy African American women presence, but it's just not just a total organization of women, right? But getting back to my friend, she said, oh, I think that when they advance like homosexual rights or this kind of rights, that takes away from the focus on Black rights. As if the need for Black rights are like monolithic, right? We know that Black transgender people face greater violence than white transgender people. Black homosexuals, they have a different sort of experience than white homosexuals, right? And so there is stratification in all elements of the Black community. But this notion that, okay, well, we want to just suppress that and, you know, move on to this other Black equality is certainly misguided. What the Black leadership establishment must do, they must recognize heterogeneity in the Black community. Social heterogeneity, all Black people aren't middle class. Religious identification beyond Protestantism, sexual orientation, ethnicity, African and Caribbean included, gender differences, economic heterogeneity. You know, there is a tendency to advance policies that are in the interests of the Black middle class, like affirmative action, right? Entrepreneurship. What about welfare, access to jobs, social mobility, political heterogeneity? I mean, all Black people are not Democrats, and that's fine, okay? So the Black leadership establishment must adopt some of Black Lives Matters principles and develop a more inclusive Black politics, okay? As I say here, it sounds good, but it is the moral equivalent of colorblind racism, in that, you know, we're talking about creating, okay, let's bring them all in. Okay, so it becomes a bean counting exercise. We got some of them, we got some of them, we got some of them. But what about issues of equity and access? Giving people who have different needs, different resources, right? So you don't say, oh, okay, you come here, you got different experiences, different needs, so we're gonna all treat you equal. And diversity sounds polite and hopeful. It's how we talk when we can't talk about race or when whites get nervous. This is a quote, actually. I didn't put my quotation marks, but this is from an article entitled, "Diversity is for White People," right? I know that's kind of shocking and provocative to think that, oh, diversity is for white people. But again, it speaks to the extent to which diversity doesn't resolve the entrenched inequality, okay? Progressive allies must acknowledge the humanity of Black people and come to view Black lives as just as valuable as white lives. We do know, I think we all in this room can agree, that we do not treat minorities, Black and brown people, with the same value as we do white people. Is that untrue? I mean, you can see it in various ways. You know, if a white little girl is missing, oh my God, right? But Black little girls come up missing every day, you know? And so, just like even our president, he cried about the Sandy Hook kids, right? And I'm not saying he shouldn't have, but he never came to Chicago, and this is his home, and he never said anything about Laquan McDonald. Because I think that we get so accustomed to Black lives, you know, being extinguished to the point where, I'm not going to say it's hate, it's indifference. And in many ways, indifference can be worse. You know, it's just a sort of disregard. We're not thinking about it at all. And you know, as Americans, I think we are privileged around the world, and we adopt the same sentiments to people around the world. You know, it just, you know, their lives just don't matter as much as our lives, right? Progressive allies must acknowledge the continuing dominance of the ideology of white supremacy and black inferiority. They must acknowledge the fact that black lives really don't matter in our society, as I mentioned. Progressive allies must see the problem as a human problem, not just a black problem. It's very easy to say, well, okay, blacks, you know, we've resumed the monopoly game and blacks haven't caught up, right? That's a black problem. It really is a societal problem because there is tension. We know that there are racial tensions. Wouldn't it be great to resolve that once and for all? You know, and resolving it may not necessarily mean wholesale, you know, oh, we're just going to give black people a lot of money, right? It may be asset building exercises. You know, it's like, okay, really committing to providing equitable education to poor people, really giving people opportunities for social mobility. It is not a black problem if we are all potentially affected. You look at our politics right now, you know, the tensions that you see within the political system, that is a problem that potentially affects us all. When there's rioting and it affects us all, even if in the way it affects our interaction with one another, you know, how we view one another, you know, whether we have regard for one another. And I think the disregard, in essence, affects our humanity. You know, if we can we are a Christian Judeo country, and we could go to church on Sunday and we could talk about how much we love God, but as the Bible says, how can you love me who you have never seen when you do not love your brother who you see every day? You know, that's a contradiction. That's not a real love. That is not loving your neighbor as yourself, right? Black Lives Matter, quote, progressive movements in the United States have made some unfortunate errors when they push for unity at the expense of really understanding the concrete differences in context, experience, and oppression. In other words, some want unity without struggle. Again, I go back to the, you know, resuming the monopoly game. We just want to sort of just cover over everything and act like, oh, it's all been resolved. Oh, we're unified. You see the pictures of the respectability politics where, oh yeah, we're together, you know, politicians. Oh, everybody's happy. You know, no. We got to do the real work. We have to, as Black Lives Matter says, we have to understand the concrete differences in context, experience, and oppression. Now here's the good news, and I hope I'm not running out of time. Oh, good. Okay, I'm going to be finished in 2 minutes so we can do question and answer. Okay, times may be changing. In March of this year, 50% of Americans saw racism as a big problem. That's a big jump, even from last year, right? Because I think largely as a result of Black Lives Matter bringing these things to the fore, bringing issues to the fore. Most Americans, 59%, said the country needs to continue making changes to give blacks equal rights with whites. I mean, that's a big jump. You know, when you consider, I mean, this is more than half. Only about a third said the nation has made the changes needed to give blacks equal rights. And I think that that's largely because of misperception. We are very ahistorical. When we pass laws, we think the next day, hey, blue skies, sunshine, it just doesn't work like that, right? I tell my students this story, and it illustrates it for me. This book is called Bitter Fruit, and it's about the relationship between blacks in Chicago and the Chicago political machine. well, this guy, William Grimshaw, who teaches at IIT, he wrote the book, and it goes from the dailies on to Harold Washington. Well, there was this one line. In it, he said that the most frequent call coming into the campaign headquarters of Harold Washington in 1983 was to ask, how much is the poll tax? The poll tax was outlawed as a result of the 24th Amendment in 1964. Okay? That was a change in the policy. But people who had been disenfranchised from the political system for centuries, you know, they did not realize, that's how disconnected they were. And so they were finally, with the opportunity to elect someone that they felt shared their interests, they were calling in, how much is the poll tax? That's the most frequent call 19 years later. When I read that, I cried, because it speaks to the extent to which we don't recognize how it takes time to change attitudes and behavior, okay? As you might expect, there is a significant racial divide. 86% of blacks say more needs to be done, compared with 53% of whites, okay? I mean, like, this measures, has percentage who say that the country has made changes needed to give blacks equal rights with whites. 8% of blacks say that they have, compared to 40% of whites. Okay, I'll end here. Silence is complicity. That's one of my favorite chants when I'm on my little protest. I love little protests. And so, you know, I think that it's, again, easy to just think of this and the Black Lives Matter movement as something just affecting blacks, but to the extent that we know of a problem, I don't care where it is, whether it's at DePaul, whether it's at your church, on your job, wherever it is, silence is complicity. You are part of the problem if you are not part of the solution. So I'll end there. Okay, questions, answers, statements? Gwen?
First and foremost, thank you so very much for coming back and sharing this, you know, the audience again. Really appreciate it. My question to you is, prior to DePaul, I worked for Chicago Public Schools. So I had a chance to see up front how devastating the institutionalized racism that has created the situation we're in now is. You've spoken of resolution. What do you think, if there was one single thing that could be done to help that situation, what would you suggest?
You know, I think that if I had a magic wand, it would just be, it would get white people to a point of understanding what you just mentioned, and that it is not their fault. That, I mean, you know, obviously behavior does play a role in what you get out of society. You have to take advantage of the educational opportunity you're given, but to understand the inequities.
Staggering.
And it's staggering. And so I think the tendency is in the spring when we get the report in the paper, oh, these inner city schools, they're still doing poorly. Oh, the magnet schools or the suburban schools, oh, once again, they're better. You know, most people think, well, they're trying harder. You know, they are smarter, maybe. You know, so they have all of these explanations that blame the victim without understanding that residential segregation, right? And that's something, you know, the federal government created residential segregation for redlining, racial steering, the practices of banks. I mean, it was started with the National Housing Act of 1934 that gave preferences to communities that were homogenous, right? So where you live determines where you go to school. And if that's a poor community, you look at heavy reliance on the property tax. right? And so if you live in a community where property taxes, property values are higher, you're collecting more money for the pool of public services like education. Different pool in a poor community, you know? And so if we understood the inequities, and so that's why I think community education discussions like this are so important. That would be my first step. And I think that if you change attitudes and hearts, if you inform people of the problem, then I think that it'll be easier to advance solutions. Right now, we can't even begin to talk about solutions because people are like, well, if they would just work harder, if they would just pull up their pants, if they would do this, if they would do that, you know, all about behavior without looking at, okay, there are some structural conditions that are just being replicated over and over again. And needless to say, there will be some people who will never change their minds. But I think that the vast majority can be brought along, but it's understanding and information.
So even in some of the, I'm a student at DePaul, believe it or not, as old as I am. In some of the discussion forums for ethics, and I'm in an LGBTQ class, it's shocking even among DePaul students how ignorant many of us are.
Mm-hmm.
And where do you suggest, and also I work in a suburban high school that is a little bit mixed, not terribly so, but a little bit mixed, socioeconomic, racially, and everything else. How do we go about finding people who are educated and intelligent enough to come in and speak to us in a way that
Yeah, it's building relationships. I guess just like at DePaul, we do have a pretty diverse curriculum. It could be more diverse. I mean, there are courses. There is a LGBTQ minor. There are Black. My colleague Chris Rivers, she teaches courses in Black politics. I have, Latino and Latin American studies. They do Latino. I mean, so the courses are there, but I think students have to seek them. And I think that, there are books. There are a number.
for us as individuals, but say we want to, I work in the school library, and we often bring in speakers and try and do programs to educate both our teachers and our students.
Right.
Where do we find people who are willing to come in and talk intelligently?
You hear about them on the news, you see them on, at forums. I don't know. Can you all come up with an answer? I mean, okay.
I don't have an answer, but I do know in other movements, there were speaker bureaus.
Right.
Set up, and I don't know if there's,
Yeah. If you go online, Black Lives Matter, some of the organizations
Yeah, I was
that,
like, go back to your slide.
yeah,
It's
they
literally
do
like almost
have,
flawless.
I'm glad you,
Yeah, go back to your slide. They're all awesome.
Yeah.
Asada's Daughters. Also, a group that's not on there, Chicago Freedom School.
Yeah.
They specialize in doing training
they
for
do
folks.
that, exactly.
Like, Chicago Freedom School, they are amazing.
Okay,
Yeah,
thank
yeah.
you, thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, so, I mean, just like this girl, Asada's daughter, they literally, they believe in community education, and not only for the Black community, but just educating others. And we've had some Black Lives Matter and Black Youth Project 100 speakers here at DePaul.
Yes, and I like coming to things like that, but as I say, for our teachers and our students.
Right,
you know,
right,
um,
yeah. And I'm available. I love to talk to diverse audiences.
All right.
Yeah.
I'll see you there.
Okay. I think I'm available, kind of.
I was just wondering about how does Black Lives Matter organize when there's a shooting? Is it just a chapter, is that a Twitter feed? Or
Yeah, well,
they
I
contact
could
other
imagine that now that
organizations?
they've started, the internet and social media is the way
Do you know
to organize.
roughly how many members there are?
I don't have any clue. But I tell you, they're all around the country. I was in at a conference in Jackson, Mississippi, and there were people there who had a little Black Lives Matter chapter. I mean, so they're all over.
Have you noticed any big differences between, say, Chicago's Black Lives Matter chapters and other ones across the nation you've read about?
Yes, the chapter here is not as developed, And I think that in Chicago, we have a really seasoned black established politics that, you know, I mean, it's like, hey, something happens, Jesse Jackson, certain people are there, and they just sort of, it's sort of like a tug of war. And I think in other communities that don't have such an entrenched black political establishment, they have been able to flourish differently.
You know, was it the fall or the summer when young people came into restaurants during Sunday brunch? Did you hear about this?
Black brunch.
So nice, you know, restaurants, people are out on a Sunday having their lunch, and young people from Black Lives Matter would come and stand in the middle of the restaurant
Wow.
and say, may I have your attention? I want to tell you what's going on in other neighborhoods
Wow.
while you're enjoying your brunch.
Wow.
And I just thought the courage, you know, it's almost easier to go and confront the police down on Michigan Avenue
Right.
than to face the kind of potential hostility or indifference that you're going to encounter.
Well, I hadn't heard of
I'm
that.
impressed by that.
Yeah,
But
that
took
is
to do
impressive. And sometimes that type of action will infuriate people.
Yeah.
Like, for example, even on Black Friday, I have this vivid image. I was, you know how the protesters were blocking the stores. So this middle-aged white man, he was yelling at the police, and he was like, they're running our city, get them out of the way. And he was just enraged because he couldn't go in the store on Black Friday, you know. But I looked at him and I just said, no, racism is destroying our city, you know, because, you know, there's a sense, and protest really gets a bad rep now. You know, protest is now seen as disruptive, you know, so here you are, you're disrupting I have a right to a peaceful brunch, you know, but they don't recognize that if you are marginalized politically, it is not as easy for you to call your member of Congress. I mean, politics does not work for the marginalized as it does those who are connected, right? I mean, if you, just like when we were marching on the Gold Coast, and, you know, some people, you know, they were looking out the window, but the idea was if you could disrupt their peace, they'll call Rom and say, Rom, you know what? You know, you better do something about that. That's the only option available to you, is the power of disruption for people who are not connected, for people who are marginalized. The only thing you can do is withdraw your compliance.
I just wanted to, again, say thank you, echo one thing was good. But I just wanted to kind of, not that you need it, but co-sign on some of the things that you mentioned. I work, I was here at DePaul, but I live on the south side, and 79th Street, they call it the 9. There are grocery stores, you know, like a Jewel or a Mariano's, you know, chain grocery stores. And I shop on the north side, I don't shop on the south side of my groceries, because the amount and variety of produce is vastly different. Wider range, better quality. And I think that this is, to me, it's symbolic of a larger problem. You know, I remember reading an article recently about the medical students at University of Virginia that felt that Black people don't experience pain to the same degree as white people. So, you know, that impacts if they prescribe the medication or how serious they take, you know, their symptoms. And so it's just all of these things that kind of compound one another to impact Black people's lives in a very negative way. You can't get any food there that isn't deep fried in mild sauce, you know what I mean? It's extremely difficult, and just me going back and forth on a daily basis, the differences are stark.
It is.
And people...
It's a different world.
Oh my God, totally different. And if you don't go to the other side, you don't necessarily see that difference, but it is night and day.
Right.
And it's killing.
And I think because we're so ahistorical, it's easy to look at what exists as if it just spontaneous, it just happened. I mean, you know, it's like Black people, they don't care for their communities. Black people, they don't want the same, they don't eat right, they don't do this. Again, that focus on behavior versus root causes. What are the root causes? Just like with my brother, who again is a cop going on 30 years. You know, he's like, but the black on black violence, it's like, yeah, that's bad, but why?
Right.
Why? It has not always been that way. There is it is corresponded with the loss of jobs. Deindustrialization has hit black and brown poor people harder than it did white people because of the limited educational opportunities. So those, you know, manufacturing jobs that did not require a significant education or skill, they're gone. And so in its wake, it's easy for the drug trade to move into an environment that is hopeless and economically devastating. So we have to begin to ask, well, why is this like this? And sort of avoid this sort of cultural or biological determinism argument, you know, like, oh, they're that way because they're black, or they're that way because of their culture. Certainly culture does play a role in your outcomes, right? But culture is does not appear spontaneously. It is derived from something. It is typically an adaptive strategy.
Hi, I really enjoyed your presentation. I'm an adjunct professor here. And I really enjoyed your bridging the civil rights movement with Black Lives Matter. And when you talked about inheritance and wealth inheritance and poverty inheritance, there's also, you brought this to light, this inheritance of protest. And if we were to just study how it's evolved over the years, Black Lives Matter is just, to me, definitely benefited and adjusted to be more effective in its protest. And Black Friday being, of course, to me, the pinnacle example of that. So I really liked how you brought all of that together.
Right. And you know, just like you look at the black political establishment, you know, I hate to say this, but you know, that was the old way, you know. And I think that people are understanding that you can't vote your way to equality. You know, structural inequality will not be resolved by your voting for Bernie or Hillary. That's the reality of the matter. You know, I'm not saying that we don't need electoral politics. We do. We do need to elect people who are sensitive to our interests. But power concedes nothing without a demand, right? And so when the people stop protesting, then we stop getting what we need. You know, I mean, it's all about demand. It's very difficult to get society to change, for attitudes to change. But we can, in fact, do it. I mean, you just look at the tremendous change, just like people were talking about how a couple of years ago, just $15, raising the minimum wage to $15, that was like a heresy. You know, it's like, what? No, that'll never happen. But it's happening. You know, when you look at marriage equality, that was a heresy a couple of years ago. Look, it's happening. I mean, so we can change things. I mean, throughout America, we are not where we started, right? When you look at slavery and patriarchy, I mean, we're not all the way there yet, but we have made some advances. But those advances have been predicated upon people who are people of conscience, who are not willing to stand by silently, right? People who will live out their spirituality and religious principles, you know, and say something about inequality. I'm sorry, did you?
I was going to say, I have a huge problem with how the media portrays Black Lives Matter. Like in the morning, I watch the Today Show or Good Morning America, and you know, I always see, oh, the rioters, the protesters, and then I was watching a video of a couple years ago, like some team won at a big university, and they were turning cars, and it was like predominantly white males doing this, and they're just celebrating, they're having a great time, and they're so happy their team won. And when you have like these peaceful Black Lives Matter protests, these rioters, these angry black people. So I have a huge problem with that. So what is your opinion on?
Yeah, the media is privately owned, you know, and so they have a vested interest in projecting a certain, you know, picture, and it terrifies people. But I think that's why it's incumbent that progressives, people of conscience, sort of eschew that, and maybe even call the media out. You know, so, but you're right, there is a different projection. When you said that, I was thinking about this, someone did a comparison of media projection of white people in New Orleans looting from stores. It was like, oh, they just they got the supplies that they needed, where it was like, hey, these black people, they're looting, oh, look at this, horrible. You know, it's like, wow, they are all trying to get, you know, needed supplies, but the projection is totally different.
I just want to add to that, because we have so many media outlets now,
Yeah,
people
that's
can
true.
find reports that confirm their point of view.
Mhm.
And, you know, I know there are people who never look at anything but Fox News. And that's their point of reference. And if you're not letting other opinions in, or if you're in mainstream media and you're dependent upon your advertising revenues and all of that, you're going to do what those people tell you, because otherwise you're underwater. So the internet is a great thing, and all the media that we have is a great thing, but it's also created this you know, octopus, you know, many-legged octopus, where you can partition yourself off from anything that doesn't agree with you. And that is, I'm not sure how you get around that.
Right. Yeah, you're right. You can confirm whatever point of view you have, for sure.
I think it goes back to, I heard a talk that Tom Brokaw gave a few years ago. And someone in the audience asked a question about, you know, the media is supposed to be impartial. And he said, look, nothing's changed really. It's not that the media wasn't impartial and now they are. He said, just the fact of the matter is that, one, we have access to a lot more news, a lot more media than we ever did. But you also have to look at who's giving the news. And where it's coming from, you know, and back, you know, however many years ago, it was predominantly, in many ways is still, white males as anchors, as those delivering the news, as those developing the news, as those reporting the news.
Right.
And he said, I honestly don't think that it's changed. We're viewing it differently and we're getting it differently.
Right. And people, I mean, just like when you look at the coverage of the election coverages, it is just so perverted to me, you know, because you know, they'll take something so arcane and insignificant and just blow it up to proportions, and now people are like, oh, why did Bernie say this? Why? I mean, it's like it has nothing to do with the issues. It's almost like lulling us to sleep. We are truly the bewildered herd, you know. We just don't seem to think analytically and you know, sort of be discriminating even with our news or information. You know, so it's really sad. And obviously, you know, if your mind isn't free, you're not free. And so I don't know. I think that, but as I would answer Gwen's question, I really do think that the key is enlightenment. I mean, if you can get people, and that's a yeoman's task. I'm not by any means suggesting that that's easy, because that takes a lot of conversation. And it also takes people who say, I mean, even in conversations, if you hear people say things that are oppressive, you know, call them out on it. You know, you could, hey, change starts with you. It starts with each and every one of us. Sure. Okay, so if that's that, I've enjoyed you all.